morning, Shira.
Good morning, SD.
How are you?
Good. So today we're going to be talking about choices.
Okay. Choices is like a really broad topic, and I think it's good that we're talking about it. And I think that it's something important for us to like shed light onto and notice the choices that we do or we don't make in our life.
Yeah, with choices, when I think about making a choice, in order to make a choice, you first have to have knowledge and you first have to be thinking. Because if you're not thinking or you don't know what the options are, then how are you going to choose?
Right.
You have to know if there's two options or if there's three or four or five, you have to know what's in front of you and then to make that choice. And so many times I feel like people don't even realize, number one, that there's a choice to be made. They just think that that's the way to do things and that's what everybody is doing or that's what their family has done, or they just think that that's the normal way of life and that's how you go about it. And so they don't even recognize that there's an alternative option. And then there's the second piece of, besides for the fact that they don't even realize that there's a choice, even if they do realize that there's a choice, they're not necessarily aware of what the options are, or they're not thinking enough to know what's the better choice to make.
I think we see so many times, like, you know, children getting older, getting married, and then like you see a lot of times young couples like really buckling under the pressure of making choices because they never really made choices before, whether it's like where to move or where to send your kids to school. Like it's all feels really, really overwhelming because nobody's guiding you anymore, but like you're so used to everybody guiding exact step to step. So you're going to go to this school and you're going to go to this high school and then you're going to go to this seminary and then here's your options of boys that you're going to marry and then you're going to marry them and then you're going to move here. And then, you know, all's good. You're living in Lakewood, you're living in Israel. And then now nobody's telling you anymore what school to send your kid to, unless you have other older siblings that send. But like, so if you're the oldest married, you know, no one's telling you which school to send your kid and no one's telling you where to go buy a house. And like people start getting really stressed because they've never made these kind of decisions before. And I'm wondering if we back up and we take a step away from that, like, are we doing a disservice? I mean, I'm talking about me as like, I'm an older adult and I have kids that age. I don't, but I'm saying, is this as a society, are we doing a disservice for only putting people in position to make choices and decisions when they're much older? And there's just, the choices and decisions have so much more gravity towards them. Should we be more fostering a culture of making decisions when we're younger?
And in order to foster that culture, the first step is like, are people allowed to think? Are people allowed to think? Are they allowed to make a choice that wouldn't be the regular choice that everybody else is making?
People don't want that. People don't like that. It's like, I mean, I think about myself. Like, I want my child to wear the outfit that I prepared for him. Like, even this morning, he got dressed all by himself and he's so excited, but he's wearing like a tan shirt with tan pants. He's like, but it does match. And I'm just color, like, it's going to look so nerdy in school. But I was like, I'm not going to fight with him to change his shirt because I'm lazy. No, I'm kidding. But I'm saying, because like, this is him. He mastered something. He picked out his clothes all by himself and he got dressed. And for me to now, you know, go and make him change into something else that I would find would make him look more acceptable, I'm taking away that empowerment of like, he made a choice to like get himself dressed and he thinks he looks good.
As you make choices, you become more independent and you feel really good about yourself. But if we never have those opportunities to actually make choices for ourselves, we kind of are disabling or enabling others. And on the one hand, like it feels so good because we're in control. We're telling them what to do, right? We're guiding them. It's almost like it's easy. You know it's going to be. And also for the person who doesn't have to make the choice, like life can feel a little bit simpler because it's just, it's given to you. You know what to do next. Like there's no need for anxiety. There's no need for worry. Like you just
there's a lot of anxiety when you have to make decisions. Like I'm thinking to myself, like the decisions that I had to make, should I do this or should I do this? It was a lot of anxiety provoking.
Right. And so it's much easier to just go with what you're told. But number one, not everybody is going to have that opportunity in the future. There's going to come a point where you have to stand on your own 2 feet and make your own decision. And then like you might not be able to do that.
I mean, like you could really try to follow the rest of society the rest of your life. You can move where everyone who's your type is moving, and you can send to the school where everyone your type is sending to. And, you know, there is a kind of a flow that you can just follow, even if no one's dictating it anymore, where you can just follow to just kind of like not have to make decisions so much anymore.
But I think that there comes a certain point, and maybe
I'm not saying that's a good thing.
Right.
I'm just saying I think you could get away with making as little decisions as possible.
And I think it's one way of living. Like it's not necessarily bad, right? Nothing we're talking about is good or bad. We're just like trying to realize, like, to show people that there's a lot more options of being and therefore like that they do have that choice. And so like if somebody chooses, right, the key is if they're choosing to have that life where they're doing what everybody else is doing and going and following the flow or going according to that trajectory, that's fine. But did you choose it? Like, did you think about it? Did you put yourself into that path? And maybe that is an easier path because you're just going with the flow. But you are in a sense then saying, well, it's not necessarily what I want to do. or it's not necessarily, well, maybe it is actually, because if you're
Right.
choosing it, then you are saying, I'm choosing to be a part of
Right,
that.
but you might not be thinking about it. Is
You might
this
not be thinking about it.
really fit into your values? This is really the lifestyle you want to live.
Mhm.
You're just choosing because this is the path that is set, and this is the path that's easy, and this is the path where you'll have as least conflict as possible.
Right.
And the more we stand up as our own person, our own individual, and having to make our own choices that might not fit in with the community around us, the more conflict we're facing.
Mm-hmm.
And people are scared of conflict. So
Yeah.
people run away from conflict. So let me make the choice that's going to appease my spouse. Let me make the choice that's going to appease my parents. Let me make the choice that's going to appease my friends, because now I have no conflict. We're all in harmony together. And you kind of like hide the conflict within yourself. But when you're
Right.
willing to face the conflict within yourself, that means then you also have to be willing to face external conflict. And it's just really unpleasant.
It is.
So people choose to stay away from it and shove it down. What happens is, kind of related to our conversation last week, that starts the living of an inauthentic life, because you're constantly making decisions that might not be aligned with yourself, because you're choosing the attachment over
the relationship.
you're choosing the relationship over the authenticity.
Mhm.
And therefore you're making choices that are not aligned with who you are as a person or who you want to be.
Right. And I think what it really boils down to is like belonging. People are then choosing belonging.
Right.
They're choosing to be a part of the community. They're choosing, and I don't even think it's necessarily community. I think it happens within families. It happens within friendships. It's like the more we adapt, the more connected we are, the less conflict there is. And then therefore, like the better off it feels. Like you
Right.
don't have to constantly
You don't
feel.
have to deal with this like inner conflict of like, is this what I want versus what I'll be seen? It's like, let's just shove down those needs and just like be the same as everyone else, and then I don't have to worry about it. The drawback of that is then you lose yourself,
Mhm.
and you lose your authenticity, and you lose your individualism. I mean, the ideal utopian world would be is that we can all make our own decisions and it would all be accepted by everyone. We can make our own choices and no one cared, but it doesn't. Now, some families it does, some community it does, but overall, it just doesn't work like that.
Right.
And that would be the ideal world, where you can think your decisions through, and no matter what school you sent your kid to, and no matter what community you decide to live with, you'll be accepted and loved by all. But it's just not. You choose this school, you're going down this path. And there's no turning back sometimes.
Right.
You know, which is why probably when I was choosing a high school, when I was choosing seminary, my parents were so stressed out about it. And it was like such a big decision. Well, I wanted to go to this school. They wanted me to go to a different school because they saw the longer vision of a path that they thought made sense for them.
I think like what happens is like a lot of times like people believe that if they marry a learning boy or if they marry somebody in a yeshiva system, they're guaranteed a calm life or they're guaranteed a nice husband. And like and so back to like the idea of like if you take this path, you will be okay. So if you take this path of like being with a yeshiva boy or somebody who is somehow connected to a yeshiva, you won't have any pain. You'll have a good life. And I think that that's a false promise because like we know there's people who are working who are completely fine and have great marriages. And there's people who are learning who are also fine and have great marriages. But in both categories, you also have people who go into it and have disastrous marriages.
Right.
And so like there's no, I think like the promise is that if I go according to a phase of like trajectories or I go according to a series of events, then I'm going to have the easier life or I'm going to have the good life. But I think like what we're saying today is that not necessarily will that give you that good life. And sometimes you have to stop and make choices for yourself and saying, what will work for me? Because not necessarily is the general path going to make me happy. Right. Not necessarily is that general path something that's okay for me to do. And I think that there are a lot of people who are stopping and saying, well, do we have enough money? Will we have enough money? What if our families cannot support and we don't have jobs and we see how much things cost? Like, how do people even make money? How do people even make it go on? And they're not sure. And they're asking themselves those questions. And maybe they themselves can't go and get a degree. Or maybe they themselves can't like work in something that's going to make a ton of money. And so they're kind of stuck because on the one hand, they're saying like, we should be in kollel, but they also really, what do they really want? They really want somebody who's working. But they know also that if they marry somebody who's in kollel, that type of person is only going to stay for 6 months to a year or maybe 2 years. And then afterwards, they're just going to go straight into working. And so like, therefore, like on the one hand, we're like all feeding into a certain game. But what do you really want? And so therefore, like, can you have that choice to say, this is what I want? And like, I feel bad because I think kind of like, if a girl asks for somebody who is working, it automatically means that what's wrong with her? And also she's going to get a worse guy, which is not necessarily true. And that also puts a lot of pressure on the boys. Like if they can't necessarily learn, or if they want to go into working and they have their drive there and not everybody is cut out for this, then can they do that without being seen, like you said before, as a bum? Like they can be somebody who's also like learning or someone who's a good person who is going to have a good home, a good Torah home, but somehow it's assumed like, no, that's the wrong path.
Right. And we're talking to obviously like one specific group of kind of
Very
people
unique,
that
yeah.
like want this kind of thing. Like I'm thinking that I had tons of friends that were only dating working boys that wouldn't
Right.
look at learning boys. But then I'm sure they have their own category of all these things that we're talking about. We just don't know that language because that wasn't, let's say, the circle that we were in.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess what is so scary, like for me, like I'm a young parent, so I'm not really faced with these things yet. What is so scary for a parent about letting their child make choices that would be different? See, the reason why why society's not giving choices is because we're so scared they're going to make choices different than us, right?
Mm-hmm. And that
What's
they're gonna
so
walk away.
scary about the different choices? Is it that somebody will leave you, walk
I
away,
think
like
that's
you
really
said?
what it boils down to, is
Leave
that
the
when we give too many
community?
choices, like there's just too much exposure, and then maybe they won't go into that path, or they won't be connected in some way, and we want everybody to stay close. But I mean, maybe because that wasn't my upbringing. My upbringing did give me a lot of choices, and I still stayed. And so therefore, I guess I'm not as scared of having choices, and I'm not as scared of thinking. But I think there are a lot of people who are scared to think, or are scared to have choices, or as parents or as mentors are scared to give other people choices. And also, honestly, like it feels good to be the one who knows all the answers and somebody to listen to you.
Right.
Like being an authority figure and having a following, that feels good. And so I think like that's also an element in it of like everybody do what I do because what I do is the best.
Right.
But ultimately, like, can people think?
I mean, it has to be taught, right? I mean, like, I just got a letter back from my son's school about that. They're doing this, like, I'm probably saying the words wrong, SMART program. The one is to develop social critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, like, giving us tips on how to practice that at home. So, yeah, they're, like, that's a way to teach 5-year-olds of how to start thinking on their own. The question is, are we implementing that actually?
Right.
Are we then giving them the ways to actually practically practice that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, like I'm thinking of, let's say, like, the thing where you give a kid like 2 lollies and you're like, do you want the red or do you want the green lolly? And it's like the red is like pushed in their face. And like, of course, they're going to choose the red. It's like in the card tricks, like when you're doing a
Right.
magic trick, you sort of like feed them the cards. So like, you know
Exactly.
which one they're going to pick. And so like sometimes like we appear as if we're giving a choice, but really
Right.
there's no choice because like there's a subliminal message of like, please choose this because this is
Mhm.
going to be better, or this is what
Right.
I
And
think is
sometimes
better.
we really believe that,
Mhm.
or we know that also.
We know that it's
sometimes
better.
it could be the factual,
And I don't think that like kids should just have like complete freedom to just choose whatever they want. They would not make good choices. Like they would eat dessert every single meal, and they wouldn't give themselves baths, and they would not go to school, and they wouldn't necessarily like do the things that they're appropriately supposed to be doing. And so like there shouldn't just be this like free reign because assuming that they're going to be figuring things out. Like there needs to be lessons. Like there needs to be some form of like a containment. But at a certain point though, that has to switch from like authority to like self-standing thinking.
Right. And I guess, like, what age does that start taking place? Because we know that the developing brain is going on to like 25, right?
Mhm.
At what age do we start kind of lessening that
It
rope?
automatically starts happening in the teenage years. Because that up until then, kids are more or less like listening and they have like no choice but to do what the parents want because they're too young, they're small, their brains aren't developed enough. But then you see with teens, like, why is there so much friction with teenagers? Is because they're saying, like, hey, I can think for myself. I can have my own brain. I can have my own ways of doing things. I'm not like you. They start to realize, like, I'm not like my family. I'm not like my mother. I'm not like my father. I don't agree with what they're saying. They're not as perfect as I thought they were. And therefore, like all the tension, all the conflict starts then. And that's when the choice factor has to start being developed and implemented. And then it also has to go into adulthood as well. But I think that's hard for parents is because they see like kids making choices or thinking for themselves as a threat to the family system, or they see it as like a threat to their continuity of their family.
Right. And also sometimes they may see their teenager making a bad decision.
Yep.
So they want to stop that. They want to protect the child.
Right. And they can, right? They shouldn't just let them go jump off a
Right.
cliff. They should definitely stop them and explain to them. But it doesn't have to be from a place of fear. I think like what happens is like all the interventions are like, oh no, you're doing something dumb. Oh no, you're going to mess up. Rather than explaining it or sitting and talking through it. Or also another thing that we can do is sometimes they have to make those mistakes and they have to learn. So if it's like an extreme mistake, like if someone's running into the street, obviously you're going to pull them out because they're going to die.
Right.
And they're going to be extremely, extremely hurt. But if someone is making like a small mistake, like, does it really matter? Like, give them the choices in the small areas so that way they can mess up and then they'll realize, like, oh, I made that mistake. And like society or the world will teach them that it's wrong. And then they'll come to it on their own. The better lesson is when someone can come to something on their own. And also, it gives you a sense of like trusting yourself of like, I did that, didn't work. Let me figure this out. Like, this is a funny story that like, it's nothing to do with teenagers. Like, it was me and my husband. We had this story. There was this blender and it's called like a Vitamix. And like they advertise that it heats up it heats up the liquids. So my husband assumed that you can just like put raw vegetables in and then it'll just cook it for you. And that's like the best solution. You don't have to wait like 2 hours anymore to make a soup. You could just blend a soup and all of a sudden you have like pureed butternut squash soup. So I told him like, no, like you don't understand. You have to put in cooked vegetables and then you blend it and then it warms it up a bit. And he was like, no, I'm telling you, like this is what they advertised. So I sat there on the side and I was like, okay, like let's see this funny show happen. And so he put it in and we bought it. It was like an expensive one. I think it was like $300 or something. And so he bought it and he started blending the sweet potatoes and carrots, and he put like every vegetable possible. I'm telling you, there must have been mud in it too. Like I don't even know if he peeled the vegetables. And so he blends it, and a raw onion also. And I'm just like sitting there like waiting for all this to happen. And then he like opens it up and then he tastes it and it's disgusting, obviously. And then he's like, sure, like it's not so bad. And so he's like, you want to taste this? I was like, no, I don't want to be sick. So like, but what happened then? He's like, okay, I guess you were right. So on the one hand, I could have like fought of like, that's so dumb, that's so stupid, like why are you doing this? And afterwards I was like, he needs to figure out that like, how do you cook something? You have to first saute it and then afterwards you can blend it. But like, therefore, like sometimes like we want to so quickly take away somebody's like curiosity about things, and we want to like take away even their opportunity to learn or their opportunity to test themselves.
Right. We might want to do that because we want to take away someone's like disappointment, pain, and that's probably where a lot of also like the overprotectiveness that doesn't allow people to make choices. It's because like, no, don't do that. You're going to hurt yourself.
Right.
You're going to be disappointed. You're going to be in pain. So let me just tell you the path that is going to fit you the best way possible.
It's more painful if they don't have the opportunity to choose, though. It's a lot more painful because basically what you're telling them is like, you're not going to be able to make any choices on your own. You're not going to be able to go in and do what you need to do or talk up for yourself or to trust that you can make the right choice in the bigger ways if you don't give it to them in the smaller ways. And so it starts out something as small as like, you know, what should I buy or what am I in the mood of eating for supper? And then eventually it goes into like, what career am I going to choose, or who do I want to marry, or where do I want to live, or what community do I want to be a part of, or how religious do I want to be, and you know, which community of religion, you know, am I going to fit into? And so it's harder for people to make those bigger decisions when they have never had the opportunity to make the smaller ones.
Yeah, that's true.
And so, you know, with these choices though, I think like the key piece of like what we wanted to like bring out is that people should really ask themselves if they're thinking.
Right.
Like, are you thinking and are you choosing? Because I think the biggest regret is when you're, let's say, our age or even a little bit older and you look back and you say, I wish I had more choices, or I wish I chose differently. Right. Because our lives now, like, we're already pretty much set. Like, our lives, how we live it today, we're based on decisions. I mean, you see all the time people make, you know, changing up their life even at old age. It's so much harder, though, because you're already at that point in a community, you're in a marriage, like, you're in a social, like, surroundings. Like, there's so much, like, that your identity is, like, already, like, built up on. Yeah. That it's kind of hard to like.
Right. But I think that if people, you know, talking to our age or older, like if people are like, you know, stuck in a cycle of having not really thought out their decisions and made decisions, maybe they don't have to uproot their whole life, but they can still start thinking of small decisions.
You can still start thinking for sure. Like I think like for the younger generations, like if those are listening to this.
Right.
Like,
I just feel like they're not. That's why I'm talking about our age.
No, I mean, what I mean by younger is like even like 17, 18, 19, 20, like those are still the ages where you have so much opportunity to choose. And those choices are really going to influence your future. Those choices are going to build up what it is that you become. And so like by us, like we made those choices 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and we're playing those out. And so like, I mean, I personally don't feel like I have any regrets. And that's like an amazing feeling of like everything that I chose well. Right. And like chose well meant that like I thought it through, and it wasn't easy to think it through. It was like a hassle and it was like stressful, but at least like I knew there was opportunities and options. And I think like so many people don't even recognize that like that is the time to choose. Right. And every action that you take is a choice, whether you were thinking about it or not. So what are you choosing?
Right. And you're also so young. You know, you're so young and you're making all these big decisions for the rest of your life.
Yeah. And that's a lot of pressure. And so I can imagine why somebody would just say like, you know, it's their parents, you choose for me because I don't want to choose this. But then how many times have I met with people who are like, I wish I knew more then, or I wish I chose differently then, because they're set in a path that sometimes it's too late. Sometimes it's not, and you can still make choices like and shift, but sometimes it is too late.
Right.
And therefore, like, are you thinking? So back to what we were talking before is that as somebody begins to think, what usually happens is that there's a lot of pushback,
Right.
or that there's, if they're changing their environment, it's not necessarily going to be received well, because we're not always open to change, or we're not always open to different opinions. Like, we're used to what we think is right, and
Right.
generally we chose it because we thought it was right. And so let's say somebody is thinking, or let's say they're starting to think, how can they deal with that conflict that you were talking about earlier, where they start to feel that conflict within themselves, between themselves and others?
Right. I think that sometimes like they have to like think it out for themselves first sometimes before they like share it with other people, because if they share it with, let's say, their family or their friends, like it might scare people, then they'll get a lot of pushback. And if they're still like in the middle of like thinking it through, it might be that pushback might scare someone to continue thinking about it. Like, forget it, it's not worth it. And like sometimes you might have to really make decisions for yourself before you share it. If you feel like you have the support of like family and friends who would like really listen to you out and talk it out with you and like hear these conflicting thoughts, and that's great to kind of like talk it out and hear it out. But the point is, like, I guess the first step is, like you said, like to start thinking and realize, like, to just question yourselves, to question your past actions in order to question your further actions. Think it through, think it out, think about what things will look like. I think that sometimes, though, people are thinking it out, but they're thinking it out through a perspective that they, and a bias that they have. So they only see it through one lens. You know?
And that's why you need to speak it through with somebody else who can give you an alternative view.
Right. But I think you also need to have an open mind, though, to hear other views. Sometimes if you want something so bad, or you were taught something so bad, you really can't see it out of that lens. So you're just like, this is what I want, this is what I need, and really no amount what anyone else is going to tell you is going to change it.
Right. And so then you think you're thinking, but you're really not thinking.
Right. So you need to have that open mind to realize that there are so many perspectives, and they're important to listen and hear them out in order to like cultivate your own, and not just like kind of stay in like a very stringent way of thinking.
Like, not to keep to that rigid path.
Right. You have to like broaden your mind in order to like really think about all options and think about with people, and then like start sharing it with other people and seeing what that's like.
And to think of like which pathway is going to take you where. Right. Like, if I choose this today, how is that going to look in 5 years? How is that going to look in 10 years? And can I, knowing who I am today, can I handle that in 10 years?
Right.
Can I handle that life?
Right. And listen, things happen through our lives all the time that people don't expect, that changes us as people. You know, we make choices that we didn't think are going to lead us certain ways, and we're in a whole different life that we didn't necessarily envision.
Right.
So envisioning only gets us so far, and thinking only gets us so far, because life, I think you said that life is just going to flow.
It will.
It's going to take you. So there's only so much. I mean, that's the whole concept of like free will.
Yeah.
You know, there's like the destiny, you know, your destiny. So there is a concept of like things are going to happen, but within those things, there are little choices that you can make that can dictate, you know, your life. I saw such an interesting Broadway like a bunch of years ago, and it was called like If and Then. I think there's been many like adaptions of like this kind of thing. And basically it was like a woman starting on a random day, and her friend was like, her name was Elizabeth. So her friend was like, Lizzie, come with me. And a different friend was like, Allie, come with me. And then like the show took off two different paths. What I found the most interesting from that is that split can happen every single second of our day. But every single choice that we can make, our life can totally split. Someone that you stop on the street to talk to, and then they tell you about an idea, and they give you a new thought, and boom, your whole life went down a different path. So I find that every single day we're making choices, whether we think about it or not, that can split our life into multiple different ways all the time. And yeah, there's true destiny, and where you're going to end up is where you're supposed to end up, but maybe how the path of how you're going to get there. And at the end of the story, the ending was the same. It was just a very different path on how she got there. You know what I mean? But the ending, it was pretty much the same in both stories, how her story ended, but her life looked different. And our life is going to look different based on the choices that we make. And every single choice that we're going to make, whether we think about it or not, is going to take us down a different path. And we can't always envision what that's going to look like, but we could make the best decision that we can in the moment with the tools that we have. We still have to develop those tools in order to make the best decision in the moment, whether it's going to take us where we want to or not in the end.
Right. Yeah. And that's where it brings us back to the thinking piece, is that just to be open-minded, to make sure that you are thinking, to know that there's other options, and to not be so stuck in your own mind about what the way of being is, because like you want to be able to say at the end, like, I thought through everything.
Right. I made the best decision that I could have made in that moment.
Yeah.
versus having regrets or thinking like, oh, if only I had known more, if only I had spoken to more people.
Right, exactly. And so like a lot of times like people will just put it on the back burner and say like whatever's meant to be is going to be.
Right.
And there is truth to that. But there's also truth to that might be a lazy response.
Right.
That might be a response of saying I'm just too scared to enter conflict. I'm just too scared to do something about this. So instead I'm just going to let life play out. That in itself is a choice.
Right.
Letting life play out the way it becomes is you saying that I am not choosing. And so I'm just letting whatever happens.
And every so often when I do have a hard decision to make, whether it's a work-related question or a personal life decision, I sometimes do say like, give it time. Like, let's sit with that for a little bit, because sometimes time does give us more options and choices.
Right.
But
that's like, wait and see. But that's not like, I wouldn't say that that's not choosing. I would say like you're choosing to wait.
Right.
So you're choosing 24 hours to see if it like resolves itself. Like that's sometimes like with conflicts, like that's what happens. It's like when you first bring it up, it's huge. And then you say, okay, let this just fizzle out.
Right.
And eventually it does on its own. And so like that's choosing to not intervene because it's the smarter thing to do. But that was a thought process. What I'm referring to is like when people just like lay back and they say like, I can't handle this and this is too much conflict. And so therefore, instead, I'm just going to let it be and see whatever happens, even if it just, becomes a mess.
Right.
And so like sometimes though, you actually do need to enter and
Right.
you're choosing not to enter. And that's not necessarily the right thing to do.
Yeah. Listen, like it's hard to make choices. Like there's a whole concept of decision fatigue, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's like too many decisions all day. What are we going to eat? What are we going to get dressed?
Yeah.
And then the bigger decision, like it gets a lot. It takes a toll on us to constantly, be thinking things through. Like it takes emotional energy. And sometimes it's easier to just be like, whatever everyone else does, that's the best route to take. But you really just have to question if it's the best route for you. So that way 10 years later, you're not looking back at your life saying like, wait, what did I do? Who am I today?
It's like, it reminds me like, I love shopping in smaller stores rather than in bigger stores, because when you go to smaller stores, there's only 2 options of companies. Yeah. It's like you don't have 500 ketchups, you only have 2 ketchups. You only have 2 packages of noodles, and you only have 2 options of, let's say, canned items. Right. And so like therefore when you go into a big store, I'm like, oh my goodness, like I don't know which salad dressing to choose. There's like 500 options of Caesar dressing. And so like somehow like if it's just like done for you, it's a lot easier, because I don't want to waste my decision making like processes. Like you said before, it drains you. I don't want to waste it on which salad dressing should I buy. So instead I want to save like that opportunity for the bigger decisions. So somehow like for me, I'm like, I want to go into a store that only has like 3 flavors of ice cream. It's like strawberry, chocolate, vanilla, like that's it. Like once there's like, I think like this is also like a study, like the more options you give people, the more overwhelmed they get. Right. And so like think of like an ice cream factory where there's like 70 flavors. Like that's really hard. It's like by the time like you get like a little taster of every single flavor, you're full. You don't even want to choose an ice cream. So there is something about like not having too many options, because too many options is just like too overwhelming. But like at least give yourself 2 or 3 options. Like don't just think that it's one way.
Yeah. And I think that, it's hard to deal with like conflict and thinking. It's hard to
thinking is hard. Like I think I get headaches from thinking
it hurts my brain sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's hard, but I think that ultimately we grow from it and we become stronger, independent, valuable people that way.
I think with thinking also is that sometimes people think they're thinking, but really they're circling.
Right.
And so like in their mind, because they're spending so much time on that thought process, they're not moving forward towards a decision. Right. That's not the thinking that we're talking about. Right. What we mean by thinking is thinking that is expanding your options. Right. It's thinking that is developing your thought, that something new is entering, and not that you're just like circling. Like let's say I want to choose like where should I go for Shabbos? So if I'm thinking the entire time of should I go, should I not go, should I go, should I not go, instead of saying, well, if I go there, what's going to happen? If I don't go there, what's going to happen? Like, what's my Shabbos going to look like? What's it not going to look like? That's movement in thought. Whereas just like saying, should I not, should I not, like that's called stagnancy in thought. Right. And so like when we say thinking, it's a unique process too. Like not everyone's thinking is actually thinking.
Right. Yeah, that's important.
So I think, one of the things that like we really wanted to encourage today and to really talk about today is letting people know you have choices, and letting people know also that in order to make choices, you need to be thinking and thinking in a certain way that's moving you towards more expanded upon thoughts that's going to lead to better choices, which then is going to lead to no regrets in your life.
Right. And I mean, that might be a strong statement, like no regrets. Because I think that sometimes we don't see the full picture no matter how much we try and we think. So there might be regrets, and that's normal. But at least going back to what we said before about like you made the best decision that you could have in the moment, versus saying like, oh, I should have done something differently, versus no regrets. Even if something turned out to the way you didn't like it, if you could look back and know in the moment you did everything right in that moment and you picked the best decision and there was no way to know any different,
Right.
then you can feel relief over that. But if you're like, shoot, if only I had thought about it, if only I had spoken to someone, if only I had made a different choice, then you can constantly be, feeling regret.
So if you're thinking in that moment, like you can trust, like I used to do this weird thing. I think it's probably like the moment that like I hit self-awareness. Like, everybody's like, when does my mind turn on? Or when do I start like remembering? Like it's like an out-of-body experience of like, it's like me, but then I'm like, oh, I can think about me. So I think like it happened probably around like 10, 11, because I had it like by bas mitzvah time. And I remember sitting there by my bas mitzvah thinking like, oh, like I'm going to remember this in 10 years. So I have to think now to remind myself that I'm gonna. It was like kind of like a weird thing as a kid that I used to do. So I would like be sitting there and I'd be like, it's my bas mitzvah coming up. I'm going to think about my bas mitzvah when I'm a lot older. And so therefore, because I'm going to think about it when I'm a lot older, like I have to think now to talk to my older self to let it know that I'm thinking about it for the future. Like that, I know it's kind of weird, right? As like a 10, 11-year-old. And so, but I would do that for like a little bit. I think like that was my introduction to like thinking about myself. And so like, it's almost like using that. And I don't do that anymore because it is a little bit weird.
You're talking to your future self every single time something happens.
But I think like what it really boils down to this concept of saying like, I am doing now something for my then. And like linking the two, how like we are living on a pathway that like one thing builds on another thing, on another thing, on another thing. And it is going to take you into that space, which you're going to call your future. And so like not every single person's life ends up in that Broadway where it all turns out the same way it's supposed to be. So yes, on a religious level, 100%, like whatever is supposed to be is supposed to be. But we do believe that there is like an element of choice within that. And so therefore, like the choices that you are making and the more that you are thinking is going to lead to a certain type of life. And obviously there's things that are completely out of our control and, we try our best. But in that moment, are you doing your best to choose? Are you doing your best to think? Are you doing your best to know your options? Are you doing your best to think, what am I going to want down the line? And that is something that is in your hands.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was pretty interesting. And, we just encourage people to go out and to understand like what else is out there and make sure that the choice that you're making is in line with yourself and also that it was properly thought out.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Alrighty.